G'day, it's Mark and welcome back to the channel. And in this episode in the Valiant Auto History series, we look at the VH Valiant and Charger. The VH Valiant was produced from June 1971 to March 1973 and replaced the previous VG series Valiant. It was the first Valiant model to be a uniquely Australian design. The VH Valiant series incorporated the American fuselage design themes and moved away from the more formal, boxy and upright design of the previous generation Valiants. The car was larger and it certainly showed, and it competed against Holden's HQ and Ford's XY Falcon sedan initially, and then later the Falcon XA. The car was produced at Chrysler's Tonsley Park plant in Australia, in South Australia, also at Petone in New Zealand at Todd Motors, and there were also vehicles produced in Pretoria in South Africa. The model range consisted of the Valiant sedan, the Valiant Ranger sedan, the Valiant Ranger station wagon, the Valiant Ranger XL sedan, the Valiant Ranger XL station wagon, the Valiant Ranger XL hardtop, the Valiant Hemi Pacer sedan, the Valiant Regal sedan, the Valiant Regal station wagon, the Valiant Regal hardtop, the Valiant Regal 770 sedan, the Valiant Regal 770 hardtop, the new Valiant Charger coupe, the Valiant Charger XL coupe, the Valiant Charger RT coupe, the Valiant Charger 770 coupe, and the Valiant Charger 770 SE. Also in the range was a Dodge utility, a Valiant utility, and a Valiant Ranger utility. Sedans and station wagon models were introduced, as I said, in June 1971, and the Charger coupes were released in August, with the utility models being released in September. The two-door hardtops were released in November, so it was a very, very extensive model range. Engine choices, depending on model, was the 215 cubic inch 3.5 litre straight six, the 245 cubic inch 4 litre six Hemi engines, the 265 cubic inch 4.3 litre six, the 318 cubic inch V8, the 340 V8, and in South Africa, the availability of a 225 cubic inch 3.7, which was the slant 6. Transmissions were 3-speed manual, 4-speed manual, or 3-speed automatic, depending on the model. The sedan had an overall length of 192.8 inches, or 4,897 millimetres, a width of 74.2 inches, or 1,885 millimetres, a wheelbase on the sedan of 111 inches or 2,819 millimetres, and a height of 55.9 inches or 1,420 millimetres. Curb weight for a 6-cylinder sedan was around 3,100 pounds or 1,406 kilograms. As I said earlier, the VH Valiant was an all-Australian design, and it featured an entirely new body which was larger and more roomier than its VG predecessor. It did not share any styling or panels with the previous Plymouth Valiant or Dodge Dart models that the earlier Valiants had been derived from. The VH hardtop models used body panels that were made entirely in Australia, unlike the previous VG Valiant hardtops, which had used imported sheet metal for the rear quarters or anything aft of the A-pillars from the Dodge Dart. And the new VH hardtops now rode on a 115-inch wheelbase, which was 4 inches longer than that on the sedans and the wagons. A big smash hit, and really the star of the show for the VH range and for Chrysler Australia, was the Valiant Charger, which was launched with a fantastic advertising campaign, Hey Charger. I really remember the Charger as a kid. I remember riding my scooter or my bike down at the Esplanade and seeing a woman driving a orange Charger 770, and everyone would say, "Hey, Charger!" It was a big thing at school. All the school kids would do that, and it really did capture the whole imagination of the country. It was a very, very successful campaign. The Valiant Charger rode on a 105-inch wheelbase. From 1973, Australian design rules required that amber turn signals be fitted to the front of all passenger cars and at the rear instead of the previous white signals at the front. And so this meant that the combined front park light turn signals with the clear lenses that were fitted to the VH were no longer legal. And as a result, the 1973 build VH series cars were fitted with amber turn signals in place of the clear lenses, and the park lights were relocated to the panel below the front bumper. A similar thing happened on the HQ series sedans. The styling of the new model was not well received by the Australian public, apart from the Charger. It was really seen, it looked really big, and it was seen as probably being too large for the average Australian. You also sat quite low, although having said that, that was not a unique feeling. Probably the Holden didn't have that problem where you sort of sat in the car with a good field of vision. The Valiants in particular, but also the Falcons, you tended to sit lower in the cars. And it was seen as quite a bulky vehicle. One thing I always thought, even when I was pretty young, the previous series Valiants, were very solid. You'd close the doors and they sounded and felt very solid. And they were quite formal and upright. And they always had a bit of an upmarket appearance compared to the equivalent Ford and Holden. And Chrysler traded on that with a slight price premium above the equivalent Holden and Ford models. That really disappeared, I think, with the VH series of cars in sedan form in particular. I think the wagon was certainly a more successful design appearance-wise. That very large-looking fuselage design, again, which looked terrific on American cars. Think of 71 New Yorkers, things like, I've got a few fuselage cars. The cars are very big, but they can kind of carry the design. It was probably almost, over-styled or looked a bit overblown. And I think also the wheels, the track also appeared to be quite narrow for a large overhanging body. And so it wasn't well received. But as I was saying before, if you look at the previous, or you rode or drove in a previous VG Valiant, it's quite a solid feeling car with the doors, whereas you close the doors on the VH series and it almost had a kind of a muffled air sort of sound as you close the doors. It sort of just didn't reek of quality in the door closing stakes, unlike probably the Falcons or the Holdens of the time. That's just a minor thing, but I think mainly the styling was something that polarized and didn't appeal to the average Australian in many ways. Having said that, the Charger was an absolute smash hit, very, very successful. But again, that was a niche coupe segment of the market. And just to give you some idea, if you look at a 1967 Valiant, there were sales of that car, the VH series, which sold from June 71 to May 73, sold 53,411, and that was about 20,000 units less than the 67 VE Valiant. In fact, Chrysler's sales were so low that their market share slumped to 9.5%, and the company went from number 3, so the big 3, down to 4 behind actually Toyota. So it was Holden, Ford, then Toyota. Some of the highlights in the range, certainly the engines. Their Hemi 6-cylinder straight sixes were fantastic engines and very well regarded in the market. There was the 215 cubic inch engine, which is 3.5 litre. There was a 245 4 litre, and then the 265 4.3. There was also the 318 V8 available across the range. A 340 was fitted to the special edition Charger 770 SE E55, and that was released in October 1972. 3-speed manuals and 3-speed automatics were offered initially, and a 4-speed was made available on Charger models from June 1972. That was certainly an Achilles heel. The car should have had a 4-speed manual from day one. Another model that I haven't mentioned yet, and I will get into that in more detail, was the Chrysler by Chrysler. And that was the luxury version of the VH, if you like. It was CH designation, model designation. And that went up against the Ford Fairlane, and to a lesser extent the LTD, but it went up against the Fairlane and I guess the Statesman, and that was the long wheelbase Chrysler product. I think during this period, what you found was, and maybe you could draw some analogies to the AU Falcon in a way, Chrysler really relied on selling a lot of these cars to previous Chrysler owners, very much so. The amount of conquest sales from Holden or Ford would be very, very small. The only exception would be the Charger, which I think would have drawn new people into the showrooms, and probably less of the traditional Chrysler buyer, who was probably older and more conservative. The Chrysler by Chrysler, again, would have appealed to that older Chrysler traditional market. And that was available in a four-door sedan or a hardtop. The Chrysler by Chrysler hardtops look absolutely fantastic. But as I said, I'll get into that in a bit more detail shortly. It's fair to say that, if you look at Chrysler Australia, its history was pretty similar in many ways to the parent company in the US, where you had sort of boom or bust. And it was always up against its two major competitors being, Ford and Holden, or Holden and Ford, because Holden was market leader for most of that time. Going back to the development of the VH series, in 1968, Roy Rainsford was appointed the Director of Manufacturing, and his place as the Chief Engineer was being taken by an American, who was Walter McPherson, and he'd been posted from the company's Chelsea Proving Ground. And in looking to the future model program in Australia, he could see that it was mainly just reiterations of the VE Valiant that had been released in 1967. And he wasn't very impressed by that. He thought that had a very limited future, even though if you look at the Valiant in the US, it actually did live on into the mid-70s or even later 70s, but albeit as a cheap economy car. But he was not impressed at all, and he felt that they needed to devise a completely new range of Chrysler products. So in collaboration with David Brown and Gordon Pfeiffer, they worked on this so they could become far more competitive with Holden and Ford. And so there was a proposal that was presented to the managing director, David Brown, and his deputy, Bob Perkins, and also an American who was the sales director, who in turn called their engineering, marketing and styling people together to discuss a successor to the VG. And as I said before, there was a very extensive model range. So what they presented was a full model line, which comprised a sedan, a wagon, a luxury saloon, a coupe and a utility model with maximum interchangeability of panels between various models. But, the availability of a huge range of options that would allow buyers to pretty well customise their purchase. And it was a huge cultural change for the company. And one thing I would say about Valiants and things, the number of models and options and colours and trims and things was very, very extensive. I mean, as was Holden and Ford, but they were really playing in the big league, particularly when you consider, where they started back in the first R-Series Valiant that had just literally one model, manual or automatic, but just one model car. And as I said, for the VH series, one of the big departures was the fact that they were going to base the design themes on the Dodge range of cars for 1970, and I guess the adoption of this fuselage design theme, which had been proposed, or the proponent of that was Elwood Engel in the United States. Not necessarily for the Australian design cars, although I'm sure he would have had a pretty big influence in terms of the approval process. I guess little did they know at the time that, once they got this approved for the VH, apart from a variety of facelifts, this would be the last all-Australian designed body style that would exist effectively. So Brown negotiated with Detroit during 1968 for a budget to design and retool for the VH, and he received $22 million for a complete program, which is, even back then, was very, very small. And this is one of the things about Australian automotive industry staff, having worked in the industry myself, is that we can deliver a huge amount for a very, very low budget. And that's just been the Australian way for many years out of necessity. What this did mean, though, was that mechanically, there would be a rebody program rather than sort of major engineering changes from the previous generation cars. So senior stylists from Chrysler, including Brian Smythe, they collaborated with Americans Maury Baldwin, Bob Hubbuck, Hal Pilkey, Raymond Canara and Peter Perry in the corporation's International Design Studio in Highland Park in Detroit. And they're also accompanied by senior modeller Bill Chinnick, and then later by body engineer Dean Bond and tooling expert Tom Lollies Campbell. So while it was a uniquely Australian design, it was done in the US, and it really became an amalgam of many, mainly American styling themes adapted by Smythe and Chinnick to suit the local market. And dimensionally, the VH fitted between the American A bodies and B bodies and put Chrysler really head-to-head with Ford and Holden for the first time. So all the original concept exterior styling and clay mock-ups were done at Highland Park, and all interior styling being the sole responsibility of the Australians. The interiors are actually very well done. The final one-to-one models were made from special plastics and had every detail that you'd expect so they could be approved. One of the downsides was that part of the process was that they used a lot of external American contractors like Aero Detroit. They did the external work. A lot of the engineering drawings for the project were then dispatched to Tonsley Park for tooling development. But as I think Ian Webber commented, it was another part of the process that really let them down, because using all these outside contractors, especially American ones, they had very little knowledge of the local market or understanding about the operating systems that existed or processes back in Australia, and that really came back to bite them in the backside. So management signed off on the design in mid-1969, with production preparations getting underway immediately. Now, at that time, Chrysler had produced all of their tooling in-house, and they had the largest tool room facility in the Southern Hemisphere. Now, as I mentioned, the car was not that well received. The Valiant looked far bigger and bulkier than the previous VG. The overall length was only a fraction of an inch longer at 192.7 inches, but the width was a massive 4 inches wider at 74.8. That's heaps in a car. And the wheelbase was stretched from 108 to 111, although I'd argue that was well overdue, because if you look at my previous VE through to VF auto history episodes, you'll see some commentary there on the wheelbase of the Chrysler products being far too short for what was needed in the market. The wheel tracks were increased by only an inch to 58.5 and 56.5 front and rear respectively. So you can understand what I said before about the wheels looking really inset on the body. Another car that suffered that fate was the Leyland P76. We'll get to that model in a separate episode down the track. So this greater width, 4 inches, that was achieved through effectively, tapering out or ballooning of the body sides. I think, it just looked too bulky and bloated, and it didn't give a good impression. If you think to an XA Falcon as an example, or even the XY, the outgoing XY, cars are very blocky, had a very wide track, and Ford really, dialed that up with the Great Australian Road Car advertising theme, that sure-footedness, because you've got to remember that in Australia, we did have highways and things like that, but often they were single lanes. There was a lot of dirt roads, a lot of potholes, a lot of rough terrain that many, many Australians would navigate just as part of daily life. So having a very big wide body over a narrow track didn't inspire confidence. It's fair to say, though, that Chrysler International staff were really keen for Chrysler Australia to match Holden and Ford in every way. I think that would have been fine if they had have actually done that in terms of track. So having just a very small 1 inch wider track, but a 4 inch wider body, that's just not on. Another unique feature of the VH design was the raising of the body belt line by nearly 2 inches compared to the VE and VG bodies, and a corresponding decrease in window height and area which had a really detrimental effect on visibility and made the interior feel quite claustrophobic. I mentioned this earlier. And again, you know, the earlier Chryslers, they were very formal. They had large glass areas, you know, squared off sides, front and rear. You could see the front, you could see the back. Very sensible, you know, space-efficient vehicles. And then these cars became very heavily styled, where the passenger and driver almost sank into the interior and had the doors up around them with very small window openings. Now, having said all of this, Smythe, who was the head of the Chrysler Australia styling, very strongly fought against this particular feature, but was overruled by the US colleagues. One area where I think it was more successful from a design point of view was the station wagon. And that was a major consideration of manufacturers in Australia at the time. Station wagons were very popular. So the wagon retained all the sedan panels back to the C-pillar, except for the roof pressing. And then the rear overhang was increased by a massive 6 inches to give it the largest load space and carrying capability of any locally produced station wagon. So I would argue that the Holden wagon, to me, was far too short. The Falcon was about right and probably was market leader in the wagon segment. But the Chrysler wagon, I think, also gave a really good account of itself. And again, if you go back to my earlier episodes on, VE through to VG, you'll see that I make some comments there about the station wagons, because the station wagons in those previous generation Valiants were too small in the rear cargo area. So they obviously wanted to fix that with this VH model. Could have been argued, though, that they probably should have based, rather than having all this overhang, they could have actually based the wagon on the Chrysler by Chrysler 115-inch wheelbase, and then it would have had less overhang at the rear. Because one of the downsides of that is that there are a lot of spoon butt drains in country areas in Australia. And so having a big overhang on the back of your wagon, where you tend to be scraping it on gutters and driveways, was not ideal. The wagon had a drop-down tailgate with a wind-down window. I think you could get electric in a Regal. And rear taillights were vertical, which looked quite nice. I think the wagon was actually one of the most effective designs, and a very nice, again, this mirrored, American Chrysler Plymouth Dodge station wagons. It had a very nice air deflector incorporated into the upper roof edge to minimise dust and dirt being picked up on the rear window, and exhaust fumes as well from being sucked up into the back. Back in the day, that's everyone who's probably over 50 would remember this, right in the back of the family station wagon, no seatbelt, just lying in the back as kids with the window down. That was just a normal way of being transported around back in the 1970s. The front design of the VH incorporated rectangular headlights. It was a very wide but shallow grille with horizontal bars. I didn't mind the front of it. I think the car definitely benefited, very much like the XA Falcon, by having the driving light option. The GS pack on the Ford, but Chrysler, you could order optional driving lights, and that certainly made the front end look much, much better. And at the rear, it had almost cathedral style vertical tail lights that were kind of cut off at the bottom. And they were quite nice. The rear taillight design of the VH actually was quite nice. They moved away from that in subsequent models. Despite the very limited budget, Smythe and his team developed 3 different dashboards. All shared the same padded top, but under the hooded binnacle were 3 different instrument packs. So the standard Ranger had basically a horizontal, broad, rectangular strip speedo in 2 halves. The radio and heated domestic controls were on either side of the steering wheel in the lower half. The Pacer version had the same, but it also had a complete set of small round instruments, including a tachometer, and probably very similar to the Regal 770 that was in the previous VG series. And the top of the line Regal models, there were 4 large round dials in a flat panel with no divider. Really nice instruments, and had a wood grain finish as well. The interiors are very nice, and also the seats that Chrysler used and the cloth options also were very, very appealing. From an engineering point of view, it was pure Chrysler, tried and proven components that some of them which dated back to the original R series of 1962 or even 1959 if you're looking at the US. And the company's Torsionaire ride, longitudinal torsion bar and wishbone front suspension was retained with a live rear axle supported by semi-elliptic leaf springs. There was certainly no budget, as I said before, for coil springs at the back or anything like that. Having said that, Ford had leaf springs at that stage and well after that period of time. So, look, I don't think it was a huge impediment to sales. It's mainly an issue around the exterior styling and the packaging. The VH floor pan was a further adaptation of the original one that was tooled for the first Valiant sedans in 1959. Was the last major pressing to be tooled at Tonsley Park. Many of the inner panels were actually carried over from the outgoing VE through to VG body. The extra wheelbase was achieved by welding in a 3-inch section in the rear passenger foot area. The first VH prototypes were coded VF-X and later VG-X and were weighted up to simulate the greater weight of the new model. And by the early months of 1970, hand-built VH prototypes were being driven mostly at night to avoid, the press, having scoop photos, that sort of thing. And Chrysler did not have unlike Holden and Ford, didn't have a dedicated proving ground in Australia, so basically had to do a lot of that work sort of on public roads. 3 hand-built VH prototypes were also shipped back to the USA for extended durability at the Chelsea Proving Grounds, where they performed admirably and they passed all critical benchmark tests. In fact, the more I think about this design, I think the VH would have been a more successful car, as a US market vehicle, could have been sold over there. No barrier testing was done by Chrysler. They had no proving ground to do that, so it was just more, theoretical design. One major, flaw was that there was no flow-through ventilation system that was designed into this new car, with adjustable dash vents. There were large, crude under-dash outlets, which did exist, which did deliver huge quantities of undirected air, but they were either, on or off, open or closed. They did devise a cable-operated controls for inclusion in the VH, but still, I think it was a big omission for, an Australian market car, considering Australia's hot climate, lack of air conditioning that was fitted back in those times. The main reason this wasn't done was that, again, with the low engineering budget, they would have had to redesign the bulkhead. I think it could have been done, but maybe do one less dashboard and put some money into that. But they decided against it. Despite a big launch and Chrysler's claims that it would lift their market share from 12 to 15%, these sales never really materialised. The Regal, which was well established as the more luxury version in the range, in terms of quality and interior fitments and so on. The standard Regal had a 245 or a 265 Hemi, or the imported 230 horsepower 318 V8, all with 3-speed automatics. The automatic gearbox was Chrysler's 727 Torque Flight. The cars also had power-boosted front disc brakes as standard. They had a stand-up hood emblem, moulding between the tail lights along the sills, specially painted hubcaps, Regal emblem on the C-pillar, nicer instrumentation and better seats. Regal 770 buyers also got the extra driving lights in the grille, which certainly looked a lot better. Radial tyres, a unique pattern cloth upholstery, choice of either a 2656 or a 318 V8, and prices ranged from $3,678 for a 245 Regal automatic, $3,748 with a 265, while the Regal 770 with a 265 came in at $3,878, an additional $120 bought the V8 engine, and many buyers did choose the V8. Then there was the Performance Pacer 265, and it's kind of interesting because it was sort of a sports model. Chrysler had established quite a good reputation for the previous generation Pacers, but now with this sort of much larger body and the narrow track, it was a little bit of a mismatch, I think. Certainly they're collectible cars today. And but it was really designed for someone who wanted a sporting sedan with, sort of bold, macho sort of style in terms of striping and colours. The VH Pacer came in bright colours, bright reds, oranges, things like that. Had a large black side stripe that started on the front door, swept all the way to the back of the car, then across between the tail lights. Then it had these large circular 265 Hemi decals at the front, had a blacked out grille highlighted by 4 red horizontal bars, and the wheels were the styled steel wheels with 14-inch radial tyres. Under the bonnet was the higher performance version of the 265 six-cylinder engine, the Hemi 6, and put out 218 horsepower at 4,800 revs. And that was, and it had a 3-speed manual gearbox. Again, a 4-speed manual would have been much better, but there was no locally made 4-speed gearbox capable of coping with the engine's output at that time. Inside the Pacer, there was round dial instrument packs, high back bucket seats, similar to that tombstone theme that were on the US Chryslers, 3-spoke alloy sport steering wheel, floor shifter, and it was $3,228. And that was certainly a bargain for what you got back in the day. Funnily enough, Wheels magazine did a test in August 71 of the V8 series, and they didn't like this reduced glass area, but one thing they did say was they felt that the sound that the doors made when they closed was a quality sound, whereas I actually am at the complete opposite of that. I don't think it sounds anywhere near as good as, say, the VG series. Unfortunately, with a follow-up test by Wheels magazine, they really did start to criticise the car. They took a Valiant Ranger with a 245 Hemi on a 1,500-mile road test, and they just said that, there's plenty of performance even with a 245, but there's a lot of things that really were fumbled and missed. For example, they felt that the glass area was much less than the previous VG. Visibility of the VH they regarded as poor. The car they thought was hard to park. They didn't like the way that the boot drooped down sharply, and that coupled with a small rear window meant that you can't see where the tail of the car is for parking. And it does also criticise the entry into the back seat, less than average head and leg room in the back, and also some shortcomings of the front seats. They also criticised the handling of the car. They said despite the grip of the radial tyres, the VH felt sloppy and slightly tankish, and they thought the steering wheel, they said had atrocious sloppiness, and it can even become scary when the driver is trying to wind through bends at anything like a brisk pace. So that really is a huge departure from the previous Chrysler models. In June 1972, Chrysler announced a new high-torque 4-speed manual gearbox made by Borg Warner, and that was to be offered in the Pacer sedan and other models in the range. And a comparison test was held by Motor Magazine, or Modern Motor, in May 72 between the Valiant XL, the Holden Kingswood, and the Falcon 500. And from a styling point of view, they said that Chrysler's shape suggested more opulence and prestige. The Falcon's the sportiest of the range of the three, and Holden was the most modern. They loved the engine performance, but they thought the handling was very, very sloppy, and they did not rate the car well in terms of road holding. Performance of the car, though, was excellent. It was the quickest of the three, with a top speed of 103 miles an hour versus 91 for the Holden and 94 for the Falcon. And despite being described as years ahead of its time, there's no escaping the fact that Chrysler really did misjudge the market with the VH, unfortunately. And while today we all love the car and think it looks terrific, I think back in the day you've got to look at it in the context of its market and the time that it was offered. On the station wagons, there were issues with the rear tailgate. The dust deflector looked terrific, kept the window clean, but what happened was a lot of dust collected at the base of the rear glass, and then that turned into mud, and then that started blocking the drain holes, and it wasn't unusual for VH wagons to have rusty tailgates after only a couple of years. So you can imagine Chrysler's absolute panic and frustration when its actual market share decreased in 1971, the exact opposite of what you'd expect when you release a completely new model that you've spent $22 million on. The bread and butter models were just not competitive in the market against the Ford and the Holden products. And it was so bad at this early stage that, senior leaders in Highland Park in the US were questioning the financial viability of the Australian operation. Also in the range of the VH program was a coupe utility that used the sedan front and front end and doors, mated to a re-stamped rear quarter from the station wagon, and a reworked VG utility floor pan and tailgate. And the ute was available as a Valiant or as a Dodge. And in 1972, Bob Hubbard conceived a special sports ute that was signed off as a drifter for production. Around this time as well, senior executives visited from Detroit just to look at ways to stimulate sales. There was the vice president of styling, Elwood Engel, great designer, and also senior manager for colour and trim, Dudley Smart. And they and other senior management locally discussed, the budget issues and the challenges that they had and what they could do in a most economical way to improve Valiant sales. One interesting sidelight of the Valiant VH program was the South African export business. And up until 71, all Valiants sold in South Africa were imported from Canada. But following the release of the VH, the sourcing switched to Australia. It was quite different to the Australian vehicle in as much as it was assembled at Silverton, near Pretoria, in South Africa. And it used Australian-made body components and electrics and trim. Most of the rest of the mechanical parts were South African. So things like the 225 cubic inch six-cylinder, the rear axle, they were all made locally. That was the slant six engine. Styling changes were on the way for the following VJ model, which was released in 1973, but that'll be the subject of a separate episode. Just a bit of history on the six-cylinder engines as well. So in 1966, early 66, the product planners and the marketing staff at Chrysler Australia, in collaboration with Chrysler International, started planning a replacement for the Valiant VG. At the time, the government had a 95% local content rule, and if they'd have kept that, we would still have an industry today, or at least something approaching it. So they started looking at, they knew this VH series car would be bigger than the VG, so they started looking at what options there might be for a new engine, which had to be made in Australia to meet those content standards. So around this time, David Brown became aware that the Chrysler Corporation was planning a completely new six-cylinder engine, and that was this was in the US, and that was for a range of light and medium-duty commercial vehicles. And it was a short-stroke 265 4.3. There was also going to be a smaller derivative, a 245 with 4 litres, which was a smaller diameter bore, and it even had a capacity potentially to go up to as much as 300 cubic inches, 4.9 litres if required. So middle of 1966, Chrysler US designers had built a single development engine to verify the design parameters. It performed really well, had good torque characteristics over a wide range of engine speeds, good response and economy. However, by this time, Chrysler was really re-evaluating its position in light of the truck market in the US, which was dominated by GMC, Ford, International Harvester, and it concluded that it couldn't go ahead with the engine because the production volume wouldn't justify the investment, so it was placed on hold. So Chrysler offered the engine to Australia with the benefit that there might be a potential export volume back to America, especially for a 300 cubic inch version. And so David Brown said, absolutely, I'll take that. Because Chrysler Australia didn't really have any engine development expertise. They'd basically be picking up US engines from day one. So Chrysler Australia sent some engineers over to work with the American counterparts so that they could work this engine up to become the future power plants for Chrysler Australia, in 4-litre and 265 capacities. They did have to, though, set up all the tooling to make the engine at Lonsdale in South Australia. So a number of Americans were also sent out to assist in setting that up. As part of the process, though, a lot of new features were planned for the engine, including a thin-wall cast iron block, using a furan core process for tighter tolerances. The engine was certainly capable of running very smoothly with a maximum rev design of 6,500. The way this was achieved was that there was cast aluminium pistons with cast-in steel struts for control of the thermal expansion, the nodular cast iron crankshafts with 7 main bearings and forged connecting rods in a high alloy steel with weight control pads at both ends. The crankshaft main bearing journals were 2.5 inches in diameter, while the big ends were 2 inches, and there was good journal overlap that ensured rigidity of the shaft under all conditions. In the cylinder head, which also had a thin wall casting, there were very large valves for each combustion chamber. The intake valves were 1.96 inches in diameter for the 265 and 1.845 for the 245. Each cylinder had its own intake and exhaust port to improve the volumetric efficiency of the engine. And that was a point that was really critical to the successful development of the later Weber carburetted models. The valves were inclined away from each other in the longitudinal plane of the engine and were operated by hydraulic valve lifters and push rods that were hollow that carried the lubricating oil to the overhead rockers. There was no rocker shaft as you'd expect, as was used in the 225 engine. Instead, the new engine used pressed steel rockers that pivoted on ball studs that were screwed into the cylinder head casting. The development process revealed very few problems, and that attributed to the soundness of the original design. Probably the biggest challenge was made around the repositioning of the distributor drive. Early prototype engines exhibited excessive spark plug timing scatter at full power. So it was determined that a small torsional vibration in the camshaft was the cause, and the problem was solved by moving the skew gear drive to a point further along the camshaft. Now, while the engine was labelled a Hemi by the advertising people, it was not really a true Hemi in the sense of a 426. A true Hemi has its valves splayed at an angle across the cylinder head so that the gas flows from one side and out the other via the combustion chamber, which has a spark plug at or near its crown, hence the name. It was in truth an overhead valve inline 6 with its valves tilted at an angle of 14 degrees along the cylinder line. And intake and exhaust systems were both on the same side of the engine. So it was not really a Hemi as aficionados of engine design would accept. So these Hemis debuted with the VG Valiants and were certainly very well regarded back in the day, and still to this very day are still very well regarded engines in terms of power and durability. So Chrysler had a great reputation for its 6-cylinder engines, and it was really feeling the competitive pain from Holden and Ford. So they really thought, how can we really, expand on the power output and dial that up for the Hemi engine, particularly now with the new 265 capacity that was available in the VH series. So one of the engine design development engineers was called into Walt McPherson's office around the middle of 1969, where David Brown joined them, and he was asked what he thought could be done with the 265 engine. And the answer was, look, no fundamental changes. You can't make any fundamental changes, and very limited budget, but you need to increase the power. And they were looking at between 280 to 290 horsepower and around 300 foot-pounds of torque. And so they said, that's what's available. That's what the engineer said. I could achieve that sort of outcome without spending a lot of money. And so they were both David Brown and also Walt McPherson were very impressed by the potential of this engine. Bathurst was also a big factor and a big feature in Australian motoring life, with Holden and Ford vying for the checkered flag, and Chrysler was very keen to get a piece of that action with the Charger model. So Chrysler did have the 4-barrel 245, but the racing team, competition manager John Ellis, they lobbied very hard against a 4-barrel carb for the 265 Hemi. They said it was thirsty, it had poor mixture distribution, it was hard to drive, had dreadful flat spots and response to lateral acceleration. And basically, in short, they said it's no bloody good. So after trying a single Carter 4-barrel unsuccessfully, other systems were investigated, including 3 Carter dual-barrel carburetors. But that was rejected in favour of the Weber 45 system. They did try an early Weber carburetor system, the 3 2-barrels, but it had great power, but it idled very badly. They were used to dealing with Carter carburetors at Chrysler Australia. So in the end, they contacted Weber in Italy and said, look, we're having a lot of trouble getting this right. And they said, look, we can help. So they ended up sending some of their staff over to Italy to sort it out. They also sent a complete car, which was a VG 4-door Pacer, which had the high-performance E38 specification, plus the required parts to convert it to the lower E37. So John Ellis went with the car. They went from Adelaide to London via Sydney, and then from London he drove across France in a very cold and wet weather conditions, some of the worst on record. He drove all the way to the company's factory in Bologna in northern Italy, and he worked there for almost 4 months with 2 engineers, Renato Vito and Luciano Terenzi, and they all got along very, very well and worked extremely well to perfect the carburetor system for the Chryslers. Now, because it was a 6-cylinder engine, and that's inherently more smooth than a 4-cylinder, the first thing they did was mount the Weber carburetors rigidly to the side of the engine, and then they were very careful to balance the air and fuel flow between each choke. And it was very painstaking, a lot of trial and error. And so they do a setting, and then John and the Italians would then take the Pacer out for several hundred kilometres of drive and testing around the Italian countryside. And the Italians were very impressed by the Pacer's performance and its amazing torque. John said that one of his favourite tests was on a hill that took the cars up near an old monastery, and with 4 passengers on board, he would drive off in top gear with his foot on the brake, and at the bottom of the hill, the tachometer would only be reading 400 revs, idling. With the accelerator pressed to the floor, he'd be doing more than 70 miles an hour as it crested the hill by the monastery gate. He said no Ferrari could match that performance. So once they sorted that out, a contract between Chrysler Australia and Weber was subsequently signed. So once they'd sorted out the carburetor issue, every effort was taken to minimise rotational out-of-balance forces, because they really wanted to produce a very smooth-running, high-revving engine. The camshaft timing was developed through a number of stages in conjunction with Wade cams, and they carried out the machining for Chrysler. Everything had to be done to very fine tolerances just to make sure it was all going to hang together. On the E38 engine, all cylinder heads were ported and carefully matched to their intake and exhaust manifolds and polished for smooth gas flow, while the exhaust manifolds was fabricated steel extractor system with very low back pressure. The E37 engine, which was a softer version of the company's Hemi 6-pack, produced 248 horsepower at 4,800 revs and 306 foot-pounds of torque at 3,400 revs with a 9-to-7-to-1 compression ratio. And for the E38, there were subtle differences to the fine-tuning of the camshafts, and it had a higher compression ratio of 10.0-to-1, and it had a 272-degree hotter camshaft duration for both the intake and exhaust cams. That engine put out 280 horsepower at 5,000 revs, and torque was 318 foot-pounds at 3,700. Interestingly, the E38 was actually more drivable and smoother than what the E37 was, because that had fierce torque when opening the throttles at low speed. And for that reason, competition manager Ellis tried to convince management to abandon production of the E37 engine entirely, but it was retained because of its cheaper mechanical specification. So mid-1972 saw the release of the E49 version of the engine, an engine that was the most powerful 6-cylinder production engine in the world at the time. And it developed 302 horsepower at 5,600 revs and 320 foot-pounds of torque at 4,100 revs. Compared to the E38 predecessor, the E49 had a monster 308-degree duration camshaft. The camshaft developed for the E49 was specific to that engine because it was designed to run with the new Borg-Warner 4-speed manual gearbox. Around this time, there was also a lot of speculation in the media that suggested that Chrysler was ready to substitute their high-performance 340 V8 in the Charger's engine bay. But according to engineers who were around at the time, there was still room for further development of the Hemi engine because the original design was still based around that 265 capacity, and it could have been expanded to 300 cubic inches. But that opportunity never really presented itself. After discussions with several former engineers and race drivers, there's little doubt that had the supercar scare in the media had not happened, which killed off, I guess, the Phase 4 XA GT and also the XU2, the V8 Tirana, there could have been an opportunity for Chrysler to have raced its Chargers in 1973 powered by an E55 engine, which would have been a 340. So more than 300 units, together with a number of new process close ratio manual gearboxes, were already imported to homologate the option. But when that didn't happen, and when that supercar scare killed that program off, Chrysler had no choice but to race the E49 version of the Charger and then sell the 340 engines by putting that into a 770 SE Charger model with the automatic gearbox. And I guess the real highlight of the VH program was really the release of the Charger. And, there was absolute jubilation in Chrysler Australia's Tonsley Park headquarters when in 1971 Wheels magazine gave the Charger Car of the Year. That was a big deal. Chrysler was amazed at the sales success of its Charger, but the downside was it was outselling, in many respects, their sedans, and it just showed how poorly the rest of the range was really performing. But the Charger was the glowing light and the real high point of the VH program. And that was the first time Chrysler had won the Car of the Year award since 1968 with the VE Valiant. Now, when the Charger was developed, it was quite unique. So, when Ford did its hardtop for the XA Falcon and Monaro, the Holden did the Monaro, they were all planned as an integral part of the range. Whereas the Charger was completely unplanned and it just happened on a bit of a whim. And as it turned out, it was a very good whim to have. But it was really a spin-off of the VH program. It was 100% not part of the original agreed investment that had been approved. Managing Director David Brown had negotiated a budget, and it certainly did not include the Charger as part of that approval process. It's fair to say that David Brown really went out on a limb when it came to the Charger program, but he was very well liked, very charismatic within Chrysler, and he generally got what he wanted. So as part of that $22 million, Brown had actually authorised internally and unofficially an expenditure of about $2 million for the Charger, and that was skimmed off the larger program. Ian Webber, later managing director, had his thoughts. Well, he thought that David Brown never actually said so. He recognised that there were problems with the VH deal as it had been approved. The long wheelbase hardtop, they could tell straight off the bat that was not going to be a big seller in Australia. That was more an American-style model, and it may have done well in the US, but it was never going to be a big seller in Australia. And this, no doubt, was a big influence on why he approved a shorter wheelbase Charger program, because you could see that's what the younger part of the market in Australia would have liked. After they reviewed the final mock-up of the VH sedan and wagons in November 1969, Brown was talking about his thoughts on a coupe with marketing director Bob Perkins, the chief engineer Walt McPherson, and the director of manufacturing Roy Rainsford. And it was that informal discussion where the Charger idea emerged. Now, it wasn't actually called Charger at that point. Some of the names that were given to the car just as part of the development process were Rebel, Racer, but they didn't go with that because it sounded too much like Pacer. And Challenger and Charger, the latter badges were obviously US Dodge performance cars. The head of Chrysler's styling department, Brian Smythe, remembered that David Brown and Roy Rainsford were coming to the styling studio one day, and around November 69, and asked whether he thought a short wheelbase sporty version of the V8 would detract from the broad appeal of the range and what it would do to the car's proportions. But Smythe was like, no, that's a great idea. He really wanted that opportunity to develop a unique Australian-looking sporty model. He thought that was terrific, and it would definitely not detract from the rest of the range. It'd probably do the exact opposite. So Smythe said, give me a couple of days to work something up, and I'll do some sketches and layouts to see what it could possibly look like. And the results were so encouraging, based on those designs, that late Friday afternoon, Rainsford had engineering deliver to the styling studios a cut-down prototype VH Valiant sedan on dolly wheels, and 4 days later, they had completed one half of the vehicle in clay with a mirror to complete the full car effect. And they didn't have enough time to do both sides. And that's a common process where you design one half of the car, you put a mirror up, and then looks like a full car. Then you might have a different styling theme on the other side. But in this case, they didn't have anything on the other side. They just had one side done. Then you use the mirror to give the effect of the total car. So they took photos of this mock-up around mid-December 69, and then Brown, McPherson and Perkins flew to Honolulu, where they met some colleagues from Chrysler's International Division to break the ice and show them this design. And they reluctantly received approval to proceed. It was then to be called Rebel, which obviously AMC has that name, Rambler Rebel, but given an internal code of VH29, and everyone would just refer to it as the 29 car, just to keep it on the quiet. And to assist in finalising the design, there were a number of people, Chrysler's International design team, including Chief Bill Dayton and also designer Bob Habak, who's also a member of the team that did the VH sedan and wagon. They arrived in Australia on January the 25th, 1970, more than a year after the VH was signed off, the sedan, to help work on the Charger. They completed a 1-to-1 clay model in February 1970, and based on ideas mainly from Bob Hubbard, but also influenced by Smythe, they included key features that were to become, synonymous with the Charger: the flat rear window, and also the distinctive sail panels that had the ducktail rear spoiler, which really was a nice part of that design. And then by April, 7 weeks later, the styling was approved, and that was done in less than 6 months from Brown being given the go-ahead. That's a real crash program to get that car delivered from concept to, I guess, styling prototype. But they're really behind the 8 ball in terms of urgency of getting the car to production. So all the tooling was manufactured off master molds or models made from fiberglass. And the engineering drawings sort of were trying to play catch-up in a way with how quickly the program was moving. So from the A-pillar, the Charger was exactly the same as a VH Valiant sedan, and the sharing of body panels obviously was a massive cost saving as well. And you saw a similar thing happened on the V2 Monaro years later. The doors were donated by the low-volume Chrysler by Chrysler hardtop. From an engineering point of view, it was pretty clever. They actually cobbled together some prototypes using Valiant utes that were cut down on wheelbase to disguise what they were. As you can see here, pretty cool design and a good way of hiding what you're actually up to. And there's no doubt that the styling of the car is really what sold it, and I think also a fantastic marketing campaign as well. And there were some other designs considered. One of the things they wanted to look at doing was even doing a rear lift-up hatch, but they're just saying we don't want a hatch. In fact, when I think they showed that sketch got ripped up by McPherson, he said we don't want to do a hatch. Funnily enough, Leyland did the 47V. That was a hatchback as well. I quite like the idea, but I think what they ended up with the Charger was really terrific. So as I said before, the prototypes were, there was a VF and a VG ute, and they had to run 50,000 very hard miles of testing in the outback, just to make sure everything was sort of was going to hold together. 12 hours of high-speed driving at Mallala Racetrack in Adelaide, and it was also driven by racing car driver Leo Gagan. So from these prototypes, all the spring rates and suspension settings were developed. Front torsion bars were unchanged, but the torsion stabiliser bar's thicknesses was increased from 0.85 inches to 0.87, and the damper settings were increased all round. And so those changes gave the suspension better roll stiffness and less weight transfer, which resulted in the Charger being a better car to drive and a nicer handling car than the V8 sedans. So the wheelbase went from 111 inches on the sedans just down to 105 inches, but the body width and the track remained the same. But then all of a sudden, that narrow track of the Valiant sedan starts to look more reasonable when you reduce the wheelbase. The weight also came down by something like 300 pounds versus a similar sedan. So again, even in base six-cylinder configuration, the Chargers had excellent performance. So I've already talked about the engines in quite a bit of detail, but, I guess just like the Falcons and also the Monaros of the day, you could buy a Charger as a base car and then work your way all the way up to the Hemi six-pack options or the 770 Chargers as well, like if you wanted a sort of sport luxury version. So they released the Charger in August 1971. That was 2 months after the Valiant sedans and wagons, which is amazing when you consider how late it was in the development process. Literally a year after the sign-off of the V8 sedans and wagons, but only 2 months later from release. As I said, the advertising campaign, Hey Charger, took effect, and that was developed by David Denoon, one of the creative guys at Young & Rubicam. Remember when I worked at Mitsubishi, we had Young & Rubicam as our advertising agency. Obviously, they did such good work on the Charger, they kept the account a long time. Basically, the theme of this was, it's very much like what Ford did with the Mustang. Only Mustang makes it happen. If you're an older person, you can have a young person's life. Everyone will be, you'll be the envy of everyone. If you're a younger guy or even an older guy, you'll attract the women. If you're a younger or older woman, you'll attract the guys. It was all that kind of stuff. And they certainly used that very extensively in the marketing to show, you'd become extremely desirable if you're behind the wheel of a Charger. And I think all the stuff with the kids saying, hey, Charger, was certainly, that was all part of the appeal. And if you had bought a Charger new and you're driving around, everyone's saying, hey, Charge, you would have felt fantastic. You would have thought, how good's this? Certainly a different buying experience. So unlike the V8 sedan, all of a sudden Chrysler had this huge sales success on their hands. And, Charger was really popular straight off the bat. Within a couple of months, it was accounting for nearly half of all Chrysler sales. Now, the original production rate had been set at about 20 units a day, but by October, they had to make it 83 a day, and they're still not able to keep up with the demand. So it was, without the Charger, Chrysler wouldn't have even lasted as long as they did. So engine choices were the 215, the 245, the 265, and the 318. Then there was that special edition of the 340 I mentioned earlier, the E55, and then there were all the six-pack versions as well. So, plus there was interior options, seats, floor shift, manual or automatics. You could really option the car up in a variety of colours and stripes and interior materials that meant you could really personalise the car to suit your own tastes. As I said, you could get a base model Charger. In fact, the base model Charger started off at $2,795, and that made it the cheapest Valiant of all the models. And it was very basic, obviously, at that price. But the most popular version of the Charger was the base model, followed by the XL, which came with the 245 engine as standard and the 265 as an option. But having said that, you still used to see plenty of 770s getting around, back in the day. And a few of my mates had them, I remember. When it came to the performance models, as part of the options, you could also get an E38, which had the big tank, the 35-gallon fuel tank, almost no luggage capacity at all, and that was really made for competing at Bathurst. Yeah, so that big tank version, that was part of the track pack. So you got a 35-gallon fuel tank with twin fillers, one on each side, that's right. The ROH cast alloy wheels, 14x7s. You got a 16-to-1 steering box, short grip, limited slip differential, a dual plate clutch, adjustable rear spring hangers, finned cast iron rear drums, and a rear brake proportioning valve. They're pretty light in the tail, the old Chargers. Remember my mate used to put a bag of cement in the back of his. Then there was a track pack special E38 that was announced on the 5th of August 1971, and they held the press release for that at Oran Park Raceway, and at the Touring Car Championship event, where there was a prototype track pack car as a Charger as a pace car, and they said that they would run that. They signalled that they would run that car at the Bathurst race, hoping for outright honours. Now, that never happened. Chargers never won Bathurst, but they certainly did well, and they filled, certainly the top 5 positions over a number of years. So the Chargers certainly didn't have the outright speed of the Fords or the Holdens, but from an acceleration point of view, it's interesting because Modern Motor did a test in August 1972 of a Charger E38, a Falcon GT 351 and a 350 GTS Monaro. And acceleration times, the E38 went from 0 to 60 in 6.3 seconds, 7.7 seconds for the Ford and 9.3 for the Holden. So, and then 0 to 100 miles an hour in 17.2 seconds for the Charger, 24.6 for the GT, and 19.2 seconds for the Holden. Quarter mile times were 14.8 seconds for the Chrysler, 15.1 for the Falcon, and 15.3 for the Monaro. So, pretty amazing performance out of a 6-cylinder engine. It's also worth mentioning that Todd Motors also assembled the VH Valiant and the Charger in New Zealand from 1971 through to 73, and obviously Todd Motors continued the production of those Chryslers beyond that up to, I think, 1976. Now, top of the line for this range was the Chrysler by Chrysler, and I think Chrysler had been a bit of a late starter to the locally developed luxury segment in Australia. They obviously had the VE VIP, Valiant, and they sold Dodge Phoenixes as well. But in terms of Australian developed cars, they had the VE VIP, that extended through to the VG models, where they extended the wheelbase in the later series cars. But the Chrysler by Chrysler was, I guess, a more concerted effort for Chrysler to get into this segment. And it was really part of that strategy for Chrysler to have a car across every segment of the market. And given that Chrysler's customer base outside of the Charger had been, older, a lot of regional markets, they were very keen to get a competitive entrant into that segment. The VIPs towards the end certainly became more competitive, but Ford was still running away with the market, and Chrysler dealers certainly wanted a piece of that action. So Chrysler started developing a number of design proposals for a full luxury car to try and capture, its rightful share of the market as they saw it. So as I said earlier, the styling for the VH program was carried out in the corporate international studios in the US. Brian Smythe was head of Chrysler styling. He was the chief stylist, and he worked with Bob Hubbuck, Bill Dayton, Hal Pilkey, and others to work on the VH program, but that also included this Chrysler by Chrysler vehicle as well. It was clear that they needed more differentiation from the standard car, and that was part of the design brief. Now, while Brown was in the US, he had seen Dodge design, which had the full loop bumper bar that enveloped the grille and the 4 headlights, and he really liked that design. He fell in love with it, and he said, I want that on our Chrysler by Chrysler, even though there was considerable extra cost involved with tooling a front end with that special grille and bumper. At the rear of the car, the Chrysler by Chrysler had a horizontal taillight theme. Again, quite differentiated when you look at the rear of the Chrysler by Chrysler compared to the VH Valiant sedan. That did lessen a little bit in the subsequent facelifts of the Valiant, where they sort of also took up a horizontal taillight theme. But certainly at the very beginning, there was quite a good level of differentiation. And then also what Chrysler used to do quite a bit on the Imperials, the Chrysler by Chrysler had a smaller back window theme, that sort of limousine privacy look. One of the other themes that they looked at as well was there were some quite nice sort of themes. There was a concealed headlight front, which would have, I think, looked really good. There was also some quite nice taillight designs that were considered. And I think for the first time, quite unusually, was a two-door version, a hardtop. You know, if you look at Ford Fairlane, there was no hardtop version of that in Australia. Of course, Ford later on had the Landau, which did not sell well, as did the Chrysler hardtops. You know, they also didn't sell well, but they look fantastic. And they were very American in their styling execution. So the cars had very nice instrumentation with comprehensive layouts for, you know, fuel, amps and so on, temperature, wood grain, like a burled walnut sort of look, and a very nice brocade style interior, or you could just get a sort of a normal sort of vinyl appearance. Power seats on the driver's side was also something that was quite unique. And then the standard engine was the 265 Hemi, or the optional 360 cubic inch V8. And I owned a VH, or a CH, I should say, Chrysler by Chrysler, a white one, back in the day. Check out that episode I've put on the channel with my friend Jared. He had a later model in a Go Green, which was an amazing colour for a car like that. In terms of the wheelbase, Chrysler already extended the wheelbase for the VH, which they needed to do up to 111 inches. And so they extended it another 4 inches for the Chrysler by Chrysler sedan and hardtop. So 115-inch wheelbase. And overall length was 196.6 inches for the sedan and the hardtop. And just for maximum tooling, costs or amortization of tooling, most of the body panels were common with the VH program. The unique elements would have been the doors, the rear doors, the engine bonnet, the boot lid, and also the front and rear quarter panels. And curb weight was higher, obviously, because of the extra sheet metal, but also the interior fittings. Power windows were also available as an option, in addition to the power seat that I mentioned before. The one I had actually had power seat and power windows, the white one. Jared's later one didn't have those options on it, and he had the vinyl interior. I had the a gold sort of brocade, and then there was also a hand-painted pinstripe that went along the side as well. The engine option was the 360 cubic inch V8, or you could get the 265. The 360 engine had masses of torque, very powerful, but absolutely drank like a fish. And it was rated at 255 horsepower, 188 kilowatts at 4,400 revs and 360 foot-pounds of torque, which is 486 newton meters at 2,400 revs, so very low revs. Now, the 360 was only $200 extra cost for the sedan or hardtop, and the vast majority of Chrysler by Chryslers had the V8. The interiors actually were very nice. That was probably the high point in many respects. There was tinted glass, option of the electric windows, a 13-transistor search-tune push-button radio with a power antenna. There was a light over the ignition key switch with a 30-second delay on it. Lots of interior lights, particularly in the inside of the C-pillars, which could be sort of rotated around with an on-off switch. Lights in the glove box, the ashtrays. There was a very good heated demister as well. Remote driver's side control for the side rear view mirror. And it was actually a very nice package. There was also the available option of air temp air conditioning, which about 90% of customers ordered. And you could also get white wall tyres. The seats were like a US-style split bench type design with high backs, so individually adjustable, but with the high backs. You could put 3 across the front and 3 in the back if that was needed. Along with probably the P5 LTD, which is my all-time favourite Australian car. Then I'd say the P4 Landau. The Chrysler by Chrysler hardtop would have to be up there. It's certainly in my top 10, probably in my top 5. The launch of the Chrysler by Chrysler was delayed by about 6 weeks, and that was mainly because of the unexpected huge demand for the Charger. So, which is interesting because the volume of the Charger would be much higher, but the profit on the Chrysler by Chrysler would be much more than a Charger. But they were putting all their focus in trying to keep up with the demand for the Charger. When the Chrysler was released, it was going up against the Statesman, HQ Statesman, but it was still up against the ZD Fairlane because it was about 7 months or 5 months before the release of the market leader being the ZF Fairlane. Check out my episodes on both the ZD Fairlane and also the ZF Fairlane on the Auto History playlist series for Fairlane. In terms of the names, there was a fair bit of discussion within the company. Some people wanted to keep VIP, but others felt that hadn't been a sales success. They wanted names like LeBaron or Saratoga or New Yorker or Imperial. I don't think they would have let them use Imperial, and New Yorker doesn't make sense in Australia. But LeBaron, I think, could have possibly been a good name. But it was Managing Director David Brown who suggested the name Chrysler by Chrysler. And his logic was that the name Chrysler was recognised in the Australian community as one that evokes, excellent engineering, strength, reliability, longevity, as well as luxury. So he thought, well, why don't we call it Chrysler by Chrysler? So the Chrysler by Chrysler, they talk about having 11 additional inspectors all devoted their time to performing 140 quality control functions. But the the reality is the Chrysler by Chrysler went down the same production line exactly as the normal Valiant. When the car was launched, there was some talk that said, look, it looks like a very big car, but it also looks very much like a Valiant. So there was some comment that it's just like another larger version of a Valiant, and I think that's part of the challenge. Even with the HQ Statesman as well, still looked quite a bit like the standard Kingswoods, whereas the Fairlane, there was quite a good level of differentiation. Although having said that, for the ZF, there were criticisms that was too derivative of the XA model as well. And it wasn't until the ZH Fairlane, again, check that episode out, that the appropriate differentiation between the luxury version and the base model really was rectified. As I said earlier, there were some really nice styling concepts that were done. There's one here which I really like. It actually looks very much like a Lincoln or a New Yorker. This is in a hardtop version. I would have loved it if they had made the car look like this. But I think the Chrysler by Chrysler was a good-looking car. But unfortunately, from a sales point of view, I'll just run you through some numbers here to give you a sense of what the market was like. In November 1971, they sold 693 Fairlanes, 458 Statesmans, and 58 Chryslers. Now, that's probably a supply issue. In December, they sold 890 Fairlanes, 461 Statesmans, and 190 Chryslers. January 72, they sold 784 Fairlanes, 244 Statesmans. So you can see that the previous month's sales were probably more dealer demonstrators for a new car, and 114 Chryslers. And in February 1972, when all the cars had settled down, they sold 1,030 Fairlanes, 266 Statesmans, and 104 Chryslers. So clearly you can see Ford was a massive market leader by a long shot there, followed by Holden, a distant second, and then Chrysler about half of the Holden sales. And I guess like the Landau, the Chrysler hardtop really was not successful at all. Sales totaled 474 units, and even that's more than I would have expected. Total production of the VH Valiant series was 67,800, and this consisted of 32,592 sedans, 9,102 wagons, 17,900 Chargers, 1,420 hardtops, 6,786 utilities. And in addition, there were 3,511 Chrysler by Chrysler CH models produced, and this comprised 392 265 sedans, 76 265 hardtops, 2,645 360 sedans, and 398 360 hardtops. Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode on the VH Valiant and Charger as part of our Valiant Auto History series. Make sure you check out the playlist to watch the full history of the Valiant. Plus, there's also a playlist on the Ford Falcon, the Ford Fairlane, and the Holden Commodore. So thanks very much for watching. Please give a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Good value car, Charger, Mr. Lewis. Not too big, not too small.
Hey, Charger!
6'5", get the whole family in. Easy, two-button entry. Reclining seats. Hey, Charger! And, what about that heavy engine, eh? Plenty of power and economical. Great. Hey, Charger! What is that?
Even on a test drive, the unbelievable can happen to you.
Charger.
To you.
Hey, Charger.
The unbelievable can happen.
Hey, Charger! Who's that?
Oh, just got from work.
Hey, Charger! They from work too?
Yeah, accounts. Yeah, they're accounts.
Hey, Charger! And,
The redhead? She's a cousin. Hey, Charger! Who's that?
cousin.
Oh, the problems of owning a new look Charger.